More than 100 years ago, warriors from the 𝗖𝗟𝗔𝗡𝗡𝗟 community were basically wiped out at a battleground called Mogori Valley in present-day 𝗖𝗟𝗃 County. The number of fallen warriors is estimated to have been approximately 800, which is really an entire generation since the population of the entire 𝗖𝗟𝗃 community at the time was less than 10,000. All this took place around 1886, and in a perfect example of pride comes before a fall, the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors were pursued, cornered, and descended upon. In fact, the damage was so huge that community elders had to initiate young boys before their time and encourage them to procreate. Nonetheless, to understand why the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 god of war known as Chepongolo punished the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 community so severely, we need to go a few years earlier during a raid that had taken place against the Purko community, which is a subdivision of the Maasai tribe. Since time immemorial, 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors were respected for their firm foundation on theism. They followed extremely strict community moral codes and rules, and also shunned every evil deed they knew would anger their god. Even during wars and raids, which Kenyan communities were known to engage in frequently, there were specific rules enacted that every warrior had to follow. Some of these decrees associated with raids and wars include not killing children, not killing women, not killing the old, not killing the physically disabled, not killing the sick, and it was also taboo to take the life of an enemy who had already knelt before you and called a truce. However, during the battle against the Purko community, 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors disobeyed all these rules, an action that extremely angered their god and invited his wrath on the warriors during their next raid at Mogori. And according to 𝗖𝗟𝗃 community elders, the warriors were supposed to confess their actions, then undergo extreme rituals in order to cleanse them, but none of that happened. Let's take a look at what transpired during the Purko raid. 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors from two different age groups had gone on a raid across the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 River in present-day Narok North constituency, which was where the Purko community lived in. And since the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors were well known for their element of surprise and bravery, they had successfully defeated all the neighboring communities, and this raid against the Purko community went successfully as well. Purko warriors were caught by surprise by the charging, courageous 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors, and knowing that they could not put up much resistance, they decided to run away. Now, having not used much of their arrows and energy, the disappointed 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors decided to kill the old, sick men, as well as those who were too physically disabled to escape. They even set the community's houses on fire, which was a clear disregard to the 𝗖𝗟𝗃's moral code. And after committing all these misdemeanors, the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors turned back for a journey back to their community, and with them brought cattle and Purko women they had taken as captives. They arrived at 𝗖𝗟𝗃 River toward noon, and since they were all exhausted and hungry, they decided to set camp and feast on several cows. What they did not know, however, is that Purko warriors had called for backup and were trailing them to recover their cattle and women. And as feasting was taking place, the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors cast their eyes up the hill behind them, and from far away, they saw what they knew was a rescue party from the Purko community. Their spears could be seen glistering against the sunset rays. So, with less time remaining before their arrival, the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors smeared the remaining meat with cow dung. And according to 𝗖𝗟𝗃 elders, wasting food so another person does not eat is one of the greatest taboos, and this is regardless of whether the other person is a friend or an enemy. Anyway, after learning that the men from their community were in hot pursuit, the Purko women grew stubborn and refused to cross the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 River to the other side with the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors. "We will wait here for our men, the men with sharpened spears. They have to bid us goodbye before we cross to the other side of the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 community," all Purko women declared in unison. "If you want to take us with you and make us your women, then be men enough. Wait and fight our Purko men, and if you defeat them, we will have no further qualms but to go with you." As expected, since 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors were well known for their bloated egos, they accepted the challenge and decided to wait for the advancing Purko warriors. They strategically organized themselves and waited for the imminent fight. But after a few minutes, one of the 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors developed cold feet and shouted, "You want to mean we have all been fooled by these 𝗖𝗟𝗃 to wait for their men?" 𝗖𝗟𝗃 is a 𝗖𝗟𝗃 term that was used to demean women. "We are all exhausted and they have regrouped, so we are clearly outnumbered. So why don't we rob the women of their ankles and wristlets? Then we can let them wait for their men alone," the warrior continued. The agreement was unanimous, since all 𝗖𝗟𝗃 warriors knew that they were not ready for a matchup with a recovered Purko team. So they tried getting the ornaments of the legs and hands of the women instead, but to no avail. the Purko women were now even more tenacious and were giving them a harder time because they were buying time for their men to arrive. But desperately, the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥 warriors decided to cut off the arms and legs of the ladies by the ankles and wrist joints in order to ease the removal of the ornaments and lessen the resistance from the women. They then placed the ornaments that were dripping with blood on top of their spears and crossed to the other side of the river with the remaining cattle. No sooner had 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 warriors reached the other side of the river than Purko warriors arrived at the horrible scene of their women crying in pain as vultures and hyenas were devouring them alive. They had been rendered disabled, which means they had no way of fleeing or defending themselves. And after internalizing the shock, the Purko warriors looked across the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 river and saw the 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 warriors washing their bloody ornaments and machetes in the river. Then in extreme fury, Purko warriors screamed and sought permission from their team leader to cross over and fight the 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 warriors in a fight of life and death. Understandably, the cruelty that had been laid upon their women was overwhelming. The team leader, however, requested them not to cross the river. "I feel the same way you do, my brothers. I feel everything you're going through. However, crossing the river and fighting them on their land isn't a wise decision, and nothing we can do to them can match up what God has in store for them. Let them carry the blood of these women as well as the disabled they killed back home in their own hands." With a lot of self-restraint, the Purko warriors respected the plea of their leader. The Purko warriors then turned to the 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 warriors and asked, "Hey, young men, whose red party do you represent?" 𝗣𝗟𝗡𝗘𝗔𝗡𝗟, the 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 warriors replied in unison. 𝗣𝗟𝗡𝗘𝗔𝗡 was the 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧's general community leader at the time. Knowing 𝗣𝗟𝗡𝗘𝗔𝗡, it's unbelievable that such an anarchic red party could belong to him, the Purko leader said to his warriors. Then in anger and bitterness, he turned back to the 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗧 warriors and asked, "What made you kill the disabled, the old and the sick? You set our houses on fire and held our women captives, and even went as far as mutilating them in this way. What crime did they commit to deserve this brutality? Women kindle the kinship fire in all communities. There is no specific community they belong to. So why did you have to kill them in such a manner? How will God perceive you now? We would have rather you took them to be yours," the Purko leader shouted, his emotions running high. He then looked down, fought back his tears, and cast a glance at his dying women. And while all the other Purko warriors were trying to save as many women as they could, the team leader took a small olive branch, attached it to his short spear the community called 𝗤𝗄, and pointed the sharp end of the short spear at the 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 warriors and said, "𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 warriors, listen to me and listen good. May the felonies you have committed today rest on your heads for the rest of your lives. May the blood you have shed from these women using your hands follow you for the rest of your lives. May their cries trouble your conscience forever. Even the vultures and hyenas that devoured them today will do the same to you someday. Never again shall you raid a community and triumph. This is the last time." After casting his curse, the Purko leader led his army back home with mourning howls. 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 warriors, on the other hand, didn't fret over the curse by the Purko leader even once. They didn't agonize either. They simply laughed it off, and they too went on their way back to their community while singing their triumphant songs jubilantly. Back in the 𝗣𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 community, the warriors were summoned for debriefing by the Council of Elders, but they refused, knowing the atrocities they had committed. Then a few days later, while grazing their cattle at 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 hills, a massive number of snakes came out of nowhere and started biting the cattle as well as the warriors. This went on for days, and since it was out of the ordinary, they reported the incidents back to their elders, and a decision was made to take the cattle off the hill and set it on fire. They did that in an effort to kill the snakes and also allow new pastures to grow. A few months later, the cattle were permitted back on 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥𝗧 hills. The pasture was now greener, and the snakes were nowhere to be found. However, a day after grazing on the new pasture, the bulls started going after each other and fighting each other to the death. The young warriors grazing would usually cheer because they had never seen bulls fight to the death and in successive days, but they would also feast on the dead bulls, which gave them a lot of strength after a few weeks. Now, since the warriors were too strong and had nowhere to expend their energy, they decided to organize fighting competitions among themselves. Many injuries were reported, and this raised concerns among the Council of Elders, so a meeting was called. At the meeting, a decision was reached that all warriors were to be sent for a raid, and the council unanimously voted that the victim will be villages surrounding Mogori. Now, as a requirement before any raid, the warriors were supposed to see the community's prophet and chief diviner for prayers, blessings, and good wishes. However, when 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗧 visited their chief diviner by the name 𝗣𝗨𝗣𝗡, he advised them against going on with the raid since the young men had not paid or cleansed for the transgressions they had committed against the Purko community. He even went on to tell them that he had seen in a vision that vultures were flying over the warriors as they headed toward Mogori. Nonetheless, as expected, the warriors disobeyed the directive of the religious leader and proceeded with the raid. They were led by a warrior by the name 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗔𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫𝗫 young boys to drive the cattle home. Then, after reaching a location by the name 𝗣𝗟𝗘𝗔𝗦𝗘, 𝗣𝗟𝗘𝗣𝗢𝗥 and his warriors joined the 𝗣𝗟𝗔𝗡𝗔𝗡 warriors, and a short distance later at a location known as 𝗣𝗟𝗘𝗣𝗢𝗥, more warriors joined. As they progressed toward Mogori, which happened to be inhabited by the 𝗣𝗟𝗘𝗔𝗡𝗡𝗟 tribe, vultures started flying ahead of them toward the land just as their religious leader had predicted. And knowing that this was a bad sign, 𝗣𝗟𝗘𝗣𝗢𝗥 tried to convince 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗣𝗢𝗥 to abandon the raider, but 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗢𝗥 was having none of it. According to his interpretation, the vultures flying above their heads and in front of them were not meant for them, but for the 𝗣𝗟𝗣 warriors they were going to slay. In 𝗣𝗟𝗣 land, the first phase of the raid went on successfully and they even destroyed a lot of 𝗣𝗟𝗣 villages. But then things started taking the wrong turn. 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗢𝗥 wanted the warriors to raid the next community, which happened to be the Luos, but the other elders, including 𝗣𝗟𝗘𝗣𝗢𝗥, wanted to head back home. The other two leaders decided to turn back their warriors, but since 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗢𝗢 remained with a larger group, he decided to go on and raid the Luo, after turning back the children and the women with everything they had taken from the 𝗣𝗟𝗣 tribe. So they progressed in the direction of the Luo community, and as they did, the 𝗣𝗟𝗣 started drumming and blowing their horns in a sequence that indicated every warrior from neighboring communities was supposed to regroup. They knew that the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥 warriors had crossed into the Luo land, and they had to use the same route when going back to their community. On the other side of the Luo community, things were not going as the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥 had planned. Apparently, the Luo warriors had already heard the screams coming from the 𝗣𝗟𝗣 community and were prepared for whatever was coming. So when the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥 warriors arrived, they were the ones that were surprised because the Luos were waiting. And after realizing they were outnumbered, the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥 warriors decided to retreat with Luos in hot pursuit. Now, unbeknown to them, the 𝗣𝗟𝗣 warriors were strategically waiting for them at the edge of Manga escarpment to execute their revenge. When the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥 started climbing the escarpment, it was nearing dawn, and as they approached the top, they heard a loud scream from a woman who then threw a pot full of ashes down the narrow path. The lady's name was 𝗣𝗣𝗑𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, and the pot she had thrown exploded in between the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗥 warriors, hence throwing the valley into even more darkness. The tired 𝗣𝗟𝗥 warriors were then descended upon mercilessly. When the Luos arrived at the battleground, the fight had already broken, and since the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥 warriors were their allies, they joined them and slayed as many 𝗣𝗟𝗥 warriors as they could. 𝗦𝗨𝗣𝗢𝗥 and his entire army were technically wiped out and dismembered. Only less than 10 warriors managed to escape, and according to legend, some of the survivors had to hide among the corpses of their fellow warriors, and others had to jump into the nearby Mogori river and hide in there for the rest of the day until nightfall. Even worse, since the ones hiding among the corpses were covered with blood from their fellow dead warriors, the vultures and hyenas mistook them for dead people and started devouring them alive. They had to choose between enduring their animal attacks or scaring them off and telling on themselves to the 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗢𝗥 and Luo warriors who were still at the scene. This was the fulfillment of the curse the �11𝗏𝗏𝗏 warriors leader had cast on them a little more than a year earlier. The legend goes on to state that the loss was so great that 𝗣𝗟𝗣𝗥 elders ordered an early initiation of all young boys into warriors. They also encouraged the young lads to marry so as to increase the population of the tribe and prepare for future battles. That's it for today. If you like the content, kindly do not forget to smash the like button below. This will help the channel grow and allow me to make more videos in the future. Also, if you have a topic you think I should cover, do not hesitate to leave a comment below. Thank you and see you again next week.